Good morning and welcome to our Awaken Resurrection sermon. It is a beautiful spring day, and I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to record this one outside. If you've been outside at all recently, you know that signs of new life are emerging everywhere. I see flowers blooming, there's fresh green buds on the plants and the trees, and it's a beautiful picture of resurrection, of that which has died coming back to life again. That's what we're celebrating this morning. We're celebrating resurrection. We're celebrating that the tomb is empty. We're celebrating that there's a force at work in the world that's more powerful than even death itself. Now, I don't know about you, but man, that's a story worth getting excited about. That's a story worth celebrating. Could anyone else use a bit more resurrection in their life right now? Yeah, today we're talking about resurrection. We're talking about new life, joy, hope emerging out of death, darkness, pain, and despair. Can anyone use a bit of that in their life this morning? Yeah, that's the story of resurrection. That's what we're talking about and celebrating together. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you'll know that there are 4 different gospel accounts. There's 4 different accounts about the life of Jesus. And each of these gospels, each of these accounts, they're particular to whoever it is that's writing the gospel. But at the end of each of these gospels are post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. So Jesus has died, he's been buried, and now he's been raised to life again. And after he's been raised, he appears to some of his disciples. Now, when people look over these post-resurrection appearances found in each of the Gospels, they notice that there are certain discrepancies. There's some details that don't fully line up. Now, for some people, this is a problem to be solved. Well, how do we smooth it all out? How do we put it all together? How do we match it all up in a logical, coherent, linear way so that it all makes sense? While for others, it's a reason to discredit the story. Well, if there are certain discrepancies, if there are details that don't match up, how can we trust the validity of the story as a whole? And I get it. I totally understand. But I would suggest that beyond any of these ways of looking at the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, that there is something even bigger and more beautiful going on here. And it's communicating a truth that I've experienced in my life and that I've witnessed in the lives of countless others. And it's the truth that the resurrected Christ meets each of us exactly where we find ourselves. I don't know if you've noticed this, but each of our stories are unique. Each of our stories are particular to us. We all have different struggles. We all have different hardships. We all have a different past. We're all walking a different road. You might be on the same, going to the same destination, but our paths are all different. We each have our own journeys to walk. We each have our own things that we've been through in life. And God meets each of us right where we find ourselves, in the middle of our own particular stories, offering us exactly what we need in that moment. And hey, what we need in this moment, it's different than what we needed 5 years from now, different than what we'll need 5 years into the future. The beauty of these post-resurrection appearances, as I've thought about them now over the past couple of weeks, is how they are so particular to each disciple that Jesus appears to. And it's truth that I've seen in my life. And when I hear people's stories about how they've met the resurrected Christ, it is so particular to them. We can't compare our stories. We can't even compare our encounters with God to encounters that other people have. Let me show you what I mean by this. Let's start in Luke chapter 24 and verse 13. We come across two disciples, two followers of Jesus. We're told, "Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem." All right, why are these place names important? Because Jerusalem is where it all ended. Here are two followers of Jesus. They've devoted their lives to Jesus now for months, maybe for a few years. They had trusted him wholeheartedly. They put their entire faith in him. They believed that this was the long-awaited Messiah that God was going to send to bring salvation and deliverance, to bring wholeness to the Israelites and to the entire world. And so they had given up their lives in order to follow Jesus completely. They placed all their hopes and their dreams in him. And a few days ago, it all ended when Jesus died. So all their hopes, all the things that they were looking forward to, all the things that they had come to believe, it all came crashing down. They were filled with despair. They were filled with hopelessness. And so they were leaving Jerusalem, where all their dreams had ended, where the story of Jesus ended. They were leaving there in order to go home. They probably had their tails tucked between their legs. There might have been a bit of shame. What's their family going to say? What are their friends going to say? All the ones that had made those snarky remarks when they left home to follow Jesus a few years back, what are they going to say now? So here they are, walking back with all these feelings of despair and hopelessness. They're walking back home, and they're talking with each other about everything that had happened. In verse 15, we're told, as they talked and they discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" And we're told they stood still. They were frozen. They didn't know what to say. Their faces downcast. I mean, can you just see it? Can you feel what they're feeling right here? Someone's asking them, what are you guys talking about? And now they're being asked to bring a stranger into their moment of pain. They're being asked to open themselves up to someone else. So one of them asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem? And you don't know the things that have happened there in these days?" Essentially, they're saying, do you live under a rock? Do you live in a cave? Have you not read the newspaper? Have you not turned on the news? Can you not feel the despair in the air? To which Jesus replies, "What things?" What are you talking about? I know nothing of this. And then they go on and they tell the entire story of Jesus. They tell about Jesus and the promise that he was offering. They talk about how so many people had placed their hopes and their dreams in him, and how all that came crashing down. They talk about how some disciples went to the tomb and they found the tomb empty and they didn't quite know what to make of it. And so here they are heading home because to them, it's game over. It's the end of the story. And Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" What an odd way to respond to these disciples. Here they are pouring their hearts out to Jesus, to this apparent stranger. There probably would have been quite a bit of tears. Just think about it. Someone that they deeply, deeply love. This wasn't just some rabbi. This wasn't just someone they were following on Instagram. This was someone that they had devoted their entire lives to. Someone that they had spent time with. Someone that they had grown to love. And this person is now gone, no longer with them. And Jesus' response to them, how foolish you are. It continues, verse 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. Jesus seemed like he was going to continue walking along the road, and these two followers said, it could get dangerous. You don't know where you're going. You seem to be a stranger to these parts. So why don't you stay with us? Why don't you spend the night? We'll share a meal. You can sleep here for the night, and then you can continue on in your journey in the morning. Verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. At the moment of them realizing who had been walking with them, who's sitting at the dinner table with them, boom, Jesus is gone just like that. Then they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. It didn't matter that it was night. It didn't matter. Maybe they had finished their meal. Maybe they hadn't. It didn't matter that they've only been home for a few moments to see their families. At once they returned to Jerusalem. They were filled with hope again. They were filled with joy. See, what did they need in that moment? They needed someone to come. They needed the resurrected Christ to come and to breathe new life into them, to fill them with hope, to fill them with joy, to show them the story isn't over. All your hopes and your dreams, yeah, they might look different, but they're still there. Yeah, that's what they needed. They needed the resurrected Christ to come and show them that there was more than what they were seeing with their eyes. Now let's look at another post-resurrection appearance. Let's turn to John chapter 20. And here we find ourselves at the empty tomb on the first resurrection morning. Some of the disciples, they had gone to the tomb in the morning. They realized that it was empty. They didn't know what to do, so they left. But Mary Magdalene stays. And we're told, this is chapter 20, verse 10. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white, and they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Well, they've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." Now at this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But just like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," Jesus says, "why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, Mary said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And at this moment, Jesus says to her, "Mary." He calls her by name, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus says, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." What a beautiful story. Here's Jesus calling Mary by name. She's the only one who stays. She wants to find the body. She wants to find, well, has someone taken the body of Jesus? Because if so, I want it back, because I want to put it back in the tomb where it belongs. I want to show Jesus proper respect. She's visiting the site, the grave site of a loved one. She's in obvious pain. And here is Jesus, the last person that she's expecting to see standing there. And at first she doesn't recognize him, and then he calls her by name, and immediately at that moment her eyes are opened and she realizes who it is that's standing before her. And what does Jesus tell her to do? Don't hold on to me. Don't stay here. Go and tell the others. Now, this entrusting of this message, of this task, of this mission, this is a deeply empowering task. See, this is doing two things. First, in the first century world, where this is all taking place, women barely had any rights, if any at all. Their testimony in a court of law was not considered valid. So whatever a woman said, it wasn't considered to be trustworthy. So first, here's Jesus empowering a woman to go and bring a message to a whole bunch of men. Doesn't happen in the first century world. And then Mary Magdalene, we know that she has a past. The Gospel of Luke tells us that 7 demons had been cast out of her. So she's got some sort of a past going on here. When Jesus gives her this task, he's empowering her, telling her, hey, I want you to go and bring this message to others. They all left. You stayed. I am entrusting this message to you. What he's doing on multiple levels is he is affirming her value and her worth. So if she had any lingering doubt left within her about her value, about her worth, if she was being held back by her past, if God trusted her, if Jesus trusted her, well, all of that is being put to the side. All of that is being cast away because here's Jesus saying, hey, here's this message, and I want you to bring it to the others. I am entrusting you with this message. I mean, this would have affirmed within Mary the immense worth and value that God saw within her. If at all she was questioning, if at all she was wondering, well, all of that is being squashed, and she's now being told by being the bearer of this message, man, yeah, you carry within you, you possess within you value and worth. It's a message that she needed to hear. And then if we continue in the book of John to the next chapter, John 21, the disciples they've gone home and they're fishing, which would have been their livelihood before they started following Jesus. So they've just gone back to their vocation. They're doing what they've always done. They're doing what they have to do in order to pay the bills. They're not having such a good day fishing. We're told actually in verse 4 of chapter 21, early in the morning, while the disciples are out fishing, Jesus stood on the shore. But again, here we are. The disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. They had no clue who was standing on the shore. Eventually they realize, oh wow, that really is Jesus. They go fishing, they catch a whole bunch of fish, they have a great meal together, and then after the meal, Jesus calls Peter aside. And in verse 15, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Again, a second time, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Now the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now this time Peter was hurt, because Jesus had asked him the third time. Do you love me? He said. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Now what's the significance of Jesus asking him 3 times if he loves him? Well, earlier in the story, before Jesus was crucified, right after he was arrested, Peter was asked 3 times, aren't you with this man? Weren't you one of his followers? Weren't you one of his companions? And each of those 3 times, Peter's response, no way. No, he denied that he was a companion or follower of Jesus. Now, Jesus had predicted this before these 3 denials. And immediately, when Jesus was telling him this is what's going to happen, Peter said, well, there's no way. But sure enough, it happened. Peter fell into that temptation of denying Jesus. And so now here we are, 3 times Jesus asking, do you love me? Almost as if what Jesus is doing here is he's healing any regret that Peter has for those denials, any shame that Peter is carrying with him for denying Jesus those 3 times. Jesus is healing it. He's forgiving it. He's telling Peter, I know what happened, and I'm not holding it against you. I've forgiven you. I'm not holding your past against you. This is exactly what Peter needed to hear. I mean, think about Peter. The love that he had for Jesus. And here he was carrying the shame of denying him. I'll follow you wherever you go, Jesus. Are you one of his followers? No, of course I'm not. I mean, this must have been eating away at him. And here's Jesus forgiving and now empowering him. Feed my sheep. Take care of my people. Go and care for others. In a very personal, intimate conversation. They did the whole group thing together, but then Jesus pulls Peter aside and in a one-on-one conversation begins to heal the shame and the guilt that he's carrying. It was the very thing that Peter needed. And then let's look at one more post-resurrection appearance. Let's look at the story of Saul. This is in Acts chapter 9. And Saul, who becomes Paul, but before he becomes Paul, Saul was a fierce opponent of Jesus and his followers. Paul was known for brutally tracking down and murdering anyone who followed the path of Jesus. And that's what Paul is doing where we find him in the story. He's on his way to Damascus to track down more followers of Jesus. It says here right in the beginning, Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. So he goes to Damascus, and as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Now the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but they did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. And so they led him by the hand into Damascus. And for 3 days he was blind, and he didn't eat or drink anything. Now from here, he goes to Damascus, and he is brought to Ananias. Now Ananias knows all about Saul. He knows about Saul's past. He wants nothing to do with Saul. Is this some sort of a trick? What's he going to do to me? Is he trying to uncover more of the followers, and by getting to me, he's going to be able to find even more of us? What's he going to do to all the followers of Jesus here in Damascus? So he's very skeptical, as he should be, of Saul. But then we're told, verse 15, the Lord said to Ananias, Go, this man is my chosen instrument. Which at this point, Ananias is like, you're kidding me. Are you punking me, God? Like, are we talking about the same Saul? You do know what he's done. You know what he came here to do, right? But God continues, and somehow he convinces Ananias. So Ananias meets with him, and he realizes that this is the real deal, that Saul actually is the chosen instrument, that Saul really has had this experience with the resurrected Christ, and that it is changing, or it's drastically changed his life right at that moment. And we're told that after meeting with Ananias, he's able to regain his sight, and then Saul is baptized. Baptism being a public declaration, a public symbol that I was walking this path, my life was moving in this direction, and now I am choosing to live on a new path. I am choosing to live in a new way. For Paul, life was opening up before him. He was walking down this narrow road of persecution, of destroying life. And now his life was opening up before him. He was being invited to walk a more expansive, a broader, a path filled with more love, a path that was more true than the path that he had been walking, a path that connected him with the deepest truths of the universe. See, this is what Paul needed. He needed this, a more forceful experience. For the other disciples who had walked with Jesus, Jesus expressed more intimate concern for them. And he does the same with Saul, but in this case, it's a bit more drastic. He's walking down a road, bright light, becomes blinded, and then he's brought to Ananias. He's humbled. And as a result of this experience, his whole life is changed. Now, let's look at 3 observations about these post-resurrection appearances. First, all of these post-resurrection appearances show up in ordinary life. These aren't some supernatural, super spiritual experiences. They all take place right in the midst of normal, ordinary life. Mary, visiting the grave of a loved one. Saul, he's on a business trip. The 2 disciples, they're walking home, having a conversation with each other. For Peter, he's doing his job. He's fishing. So all of these encounters, they take place in the middle of normal, ordinary life. See, what this means is that where is the resurrected Christ found? The resurrected Christ isn't found in the supernatural moments, in the super spiritual, in the mystical moments. Sure, sometimes those things do occur, but the resurrected Christ is found in the everyday. He's found in the normal, in the ordinary, in the daily routines and rituals that we all have. The resurrected Christ is found on your way to work, in the middle of work, when you're sharing a meal, when you're lying in bed at night, when you're walking around the neighborhood, having a conversation with a friend, a loved one, a family member. As you're walking around the neighborhood yourself, doing your yard work, the resurrected Christ is found in the midst of normal, ordinary life. And the resurrected Christ comes to you. Yeah, that's an important part of this as well. All the disciples, they're going about life. They're going about their normal business. They're not seeking God in that particular moment, but rather the divine is coming to them. The divine is coming to where they happen to be. And then a second observation. Let's talk about common and particular, or the universal in particular. All these experiences, all the things that these disciples are feeling and what they're going through, they're universal experiences that we all have. Who hasn't felt shame at some point for where they've been in life, for a decision, for something that they've said? Who hasn't felt a sense of hopelessness? Who hasn't had their hopes and dreams ripped out from their chest? Who hasn't had their joy squashed? Who hasn't been walking down a particular path and realized the need to walk down a better path? a more loving path, a more grace-filled path, a path that fills you with more life and more truth. Who hasn't been haunted by regret, or who hasn't been held back by sin or a mistake that they've made in the past? I mean, these are all universal, common experiences. But in the midst of these universal experiences is the particular. It's the particular way in which the resurrected Christ comes to these disciples in these universal moments that we all experience. See, each of the disciples needed something different from God. Mary needed Jesus to call her name. Peter, he needed an intimate conversation 3 times. 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? To restore and to heal those 3 times in which he had denied Jesus. Saul, he needed a bit more of a push. He needed something a little bit more drastic, you might say. Or for the 2 disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, walking back home, they needed someone to enter into the story with them. They needed someone with whom they could share all that they were feeling, their disappointments. They needed someone with whom they could shed tears and for it to be all right. So we all have these universal experiences and feelings and emotions, but the way in which Christ meets us in those moments is particular to our story, to how we've been wired, to our past, to what we've been through, to what we're carrying around behind us and in our minds, to the narratives that we're telling ourselves. Which leads to the third observation, which is resurrection is an invitation to see. It's an invitation to see. If you'll notice, in all of these encounters, initially, none of the disciples recognized Jesus. He was walking right there with them. He was showing up right in front of them. But it wasn't until a little bit later that something clicked for them, that their eyes were open. I mean, think about Saul. He went from being blind to being able to see. So there was something that happened. There was a moment in that encounter where they went from not being able to see to having their eyes opened. See, resurrection is a way for us to see things in a whole new way. It's an invitation for us to leave behind a past way of thinking, a past way of believing, of organizing our lives, of experiencing life. It's an invitation to leave all that behind and to step into a whole new way of living. In a very controversial quote from the new Star Wars trilogy, as Kylo Ren says, it's about letting the past die. Yeah, we see this particularly in the encounter with Mary at the tomb, where Jesus tells her, don't hold on to me. There was an old way of doing things. There was an old way in which you believed. There was an old way you believed in which God was going to work. But that all is in the past. That all needs to die because God is doing a whole new thing. Resurrection, the path of resurrection, the truth of resurrection is even better than that which you believed. It's an invitation to believe, to see, to taste, and to touch, and to experience that there is more going on than what you see right in front of you. Resurrection is an invitation to trust that what you see in front of you isn't all that's going on. It's an invitation to trust that there's a force that's bigger than your sin, that's more powerful than your shame, that's stronger than death itself. It's an invitation to trust that the strongest, most enduring force in this universe is love, and that nothing can overcome that love. See, that's the story story that we're being invited to step into today. And the truth about resurrection, it goes beyond just an intellectual belief. See, resurrection is something that we touch, taste, see, and experience. And once we experience it, once we touch it and taste it ourselves, we want to spread it to the ends of the earth. It's an encounter with love. It's an encounter that shows us the strongest force that's bigger than anything else that we will face in this world is love. And that love can carry us through anything. Yeah, resurrection shows us the love of God that is for each of us. The love of God that meets us right where we find ourselves and offers us exactly what we need in our current moment. See, for the disciples of Jesus, the story ended in bad news. The story ended in despair. It ended in hopelessness. It ended with everyone going back home, back to their life before Jesus came and inspired them and instilled hope and worth and value within them. And for the disciples, it was almost as if life were to go back to normal, to how it was before, that those few months or those few years of everything being different, well, that was an anomaly. See, they were tempted to believe how we've been programmed to believe, that sin and injustice and evil and suffering and pain, that they have the last word. And for a moment, that's what the disciples believed. That's where they were. That's what, for many of us, that's the story that we've believed. That's the story that we're programmed to believe, the story that's placed in front of us at all times. But Jesus turns the story upside down, and he comes to each of the disciples in their own way, in the way in which they needed, and shows them, yeah, the story isn't over. Your story isn't over. God's work in the world isn't over. There's more of your story to write. There's more of God's story to write. There's more healing. There's more hope. There's more joy. There's more life. There's more love to experience and to pass around to those around you. So this resurrection season, as we celebrate resurrection a bit differently this year from our own homes, my prayer for you is that you would meet the resurrected Christ. Maybe you're asking, maybe you're wondering, well, where is the resurrected Christ? Well, I would ask you, where do you need some good news this morning? Where do you need some hope? Anyone here, you need some joy. Anyone, you need to be filled with value. You need to be reminded of your worth. Anyone this morning, you've been walking down a path and you're realizing it's not the best path for you or for the world. I would argue that wherever your greatest need is, wherever you most need some good news this morning, that's where the resurrected Christ is, meeting you right there in your greatest place of need and offering you words of hope, of comfort, of healing, of forgiveness. So may you experience in a fresh way the resurrected Christ this year. May your eyes be open. If in any way your eyes are closed or you're walking unaware to the resurrected Christ in your midst, my prayer for you is that your eyes would be opened, that scales would fall from your eyes, that you would discover a love that is walking with you, a love that is calling your name, a love that is meeting you right where you find yourself this morning. So may you touch, taste, see, experience, and trust resurrection. May it change your life. May it give you hope, and may it help you see that love is the most powerful force in the world, even more powerful than death itself. Grace and peace to you, my friends.